Okay, now that we're all set up with our solution for our project that we're going to be working in, we're going to go ahead and kind of go over the basics of the UnrealScript language. We're going to talk about classes and how you can extend classes and use inheritance for that. Some of the terms we're going to be using may be unfamiliar to you if you're not used to object-oriented programming. So we'll try to cover all of that stuff and make sure that we explain the terms. If you are familiar with it, then you'll be able to move along pretty quickly and understand what's going on. So we're going to be talking about classes and extending classes, and then we're also going to just go over the basic variables available in UnrealScript. They're very similar to programming language such as C++ or Java. And then we're going to go over a little bit more of the specific breakdown of an UnrealScript file, such as the default properties of the file, which are stored in the same UC file class itself, as well as how you can define your own internal functions and override functions if you are extending from a base class. So that's a lot of terms right there. If you're not used to programming, just kind of hang with us and we'll get through this. So what we're going to do first is set up a example file. So I'm going to right click on the solution and say add new item. Normally you would be putting these new items probably in a subfolder for organization, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to go ahead and kind of put it here at the top. And you can see, because we have Infringe installed in Visual Studio here, we come with a good array of different template files that you can kind of generate here. These are common things that you'll be doing when you're working in UnrealScript on a project. You'll notice there's the 3 different Kismet default files or templates, and those are for extending functionality basically to the Kismet scripting, which is their high-level scripting that is available in the editor. So if you have a new piece of functionality that you write in UnrealScript, maybe you add a new weapon or you create a new enemy type or AI type, then what you can do is add these custom Kismet files that will expose that functionality or whatever functionality you define to be exposed to the Kismet side of things, which can be manipulated from the editor side and done all through the level scripting. But for right now, since we're going to be talking about kind of the class structure and the different variables and some of the basics of just working in UnrealScript, we're just going to use a regular UnrealScript file here. And we'll just call this overview. Okay, so here we have just a basic file that is created from the UnrealScript template, and it literally has the bare bones. It is a class declaration, which you can see right here using the class keyword. And we've called our class overview since that's what we titled our file over here. And by default, it extends, which is also the term UnrealScript uses for inheritance. So if you're used to, again, C-style programming, then this would be inherits from concept. And we're inheriting from the base class in UnrealScript called object. Unreal Engine has, or UnrealScript has, a few kind of base objects, and one of them is actor, and that's going to be for anything that is going to basically show up in your world. Characters are derived from actor, even static meshes are derived from actor. Everything just about that you would place in a level and sort of interact within the game at its core is an actor to the Unreal Engine. Object is something more kind of abstract than that. This is going to be your general object that has like your base properties such as a location, rotation, all that stuff. So all that stuff comes from the object base class, and you automatically get that when you extend from it, and then you can add your own custom things to it. We'll go over the inheritance stuff a lot more here in a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of cover the default template here, just so you know. You also see this declaration for default properties. This is an UnrealScript kind of standard thing that the default properties are at the bottom of each file. And that's just saying any variables or internal members to this class that you set up here, somewhere in this range of the file, then in the default properties you can go ahead and initialize those to any values if you want a starting value for those variables, and then that will be set up whenever an instance of that object is created in the editor, for instance. Then you would have some variables already come with a default. An example of that would be, if you have something that has a Boolean value of true or false, and by default you want this to always be true, but you give the person in the editor or who's going to be using this object, they have the option to set it to false, but you want it to default to true. That would be in the default properties. All right, so before we go any further with class stuff and some of the more object-oriented elements, let's just talk about the basic variables available in UnrealScript. Okay, so what we just did there was put in a comment line. The comment is delineated by the 2 forward slashes here, Basically, after that, anything on this line will be considered a comment, which means that the script interpreter or compiler will move over top of that and not really do anything with it. It's just for readability and for communicating what you're doing in the file. If you've done any programming, you know how important commenting is. It's important no matter what you're doing, whether it's in Kismet at the high level or here in UnrealScript, which is, a little bit more in depth and definitely a little harder to follow. If you're new to a file, then comments are going to be critical for you to sort of be able to understand what the author was kind of setting up and what the original intention was. So we'll be using comments a lot. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about the variables available in UnrealScript. The first one, which is very basic and is, depending on what you're doing, you may not use that much, but we want to just make sure we cover everything here, is a byte. A byte is a single byte value ranging from 0 to 255. This is very similar to, or the same as, the char variable in C-style programming, which is used to represent a single character in a string. So a string, for instance, which could be an array of characters, is basically an array of bytes, and that's what this byte variable represents. So okay, the next one we're going to talk about is the int, just int. Now, int stands for integer, which is basically a number with a non-decimal or non-floating point value. So this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, but not 1.5. If you want the decimal value, then you have to use a floating point value, which is a separate variable that we'll cover in a second. So integers are very useful for, just your basic math. But for something like as complex as a position in the world, because you want to have that precision of being able to move something, in the case of Unreal, an integer value would force you to move everything in 1 unit in the editor terms, which, depending on your configuration, may be 1 meter, which is a lot, a pretty big step. So that's when you would use a floating point value to be able to move kind of, at any range of value between 0 and 1, for instance, in the case of moving an object up to a meter. But an integer would basically force you to the non-floating point value. So this is going to be useful for a lot of things. You'll use integers a lot in code, in UnrealScript, for instance, but you want to just keep in mind what your use of your variable is and kind of think of that ahead of time to make sure that you know what operations you're going to be doing on the variable, whether it's any math. And if you are going to be doing math on it, basically know that if you're using an integer value, it's going to be rounded to the nearest, whole number whenever you do an operation on it. So you could lose some precision or even have some what may appear to be subtle math errors if you're expecting the floating point value. The other thing about integers is that they are 32-bit, whereas a byte is 8 bits. So essentially, an integer is the equivalent of 4 bytes, which is relevant for the number of value that can actually be stored. Like, for instance, the byte up here can only store a range from 0 to 255 because of it being an 8-bit value. Now, with a 32-bit value, in the case of the integer, you have a much wider range or a much larger range coming in around 2 billion instead of 255, so quite a big difference there. And you don't really need to know, unless you're doing low-level programming, the specifics of what an integer can store, but just know that a byte is very limited in what it can be used for, and an integer can hold a lot more. You should use int when possible and save byte for advanced things like writing to a file or network replication type usage case. But you also, again, want to plan ahead as far as know what you're using your variables for, and if, for instance, you need this value just to basically represent a state, then, and you have a fixed number of states for, your object or your actor, then an integer is overkill because you don't need, 400,000 states. You probably only need 10. So you can use a byte for that and easily just range, your values from 1 to 10. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is the bool. The bool value under the hood is actually 32-bit. But what the bool is used for is just to represent true and false. So in code, you're going to see bools used a lot for kind of tracking conditionals, such as if statements. If this particular state or this value is true, then I want to do something. So in your functions or your logic that you're writing, you can use the bools to sort of track any changes to an object. Am I taking damage? That could be a bool. So you could have a condition in a function that's processing, every game tick that says, if I'm taking damage, do this, play an audio effect or play a particle effect or something like that. That's a very basic example, but just, kind of trying to explain what you would be tracking these for. That's along those lines. Okay, so we already talked a little bit about this, but next is the float. So a float is also a 32-bit value, like the integer, but as we were saying, the float value can store the decimal value of a number, so you have a lot more precision with that, and so that's going to be a lot more useful, for things like position, like we talked about earlier, or rotation, basically anything that you need kind of a high precision number for, and that's going to be a float value. And next we're going to talk about string. A string is what we use to represent basically a word or a sentence. It breaks down to a byte is a character. So if you have, the letter A can be stored in a single byte. So if you wanted to have the word apple and you display that as a comment or, output to the screen, you would need a string to store the word apple. And that string would be an array or a list of these byte values, each containing its own letter. Strings are a pretty in-depth subject, and there's extra stuff we can talk about on the strings a little bit later. They have different operations that you can do on strings, because what you're going to be doing a lot in script is going to be taking strings and concatenating them together, to be able to put messages out to the screen, whether also logging errors. If you're trying to kind of troubleshoot things, you can use errors, and they have special functions built in to operate on strings that will allow you to put together a sentence out of multiple strings and all that stuff. It'll make more sense when we get to it. So there are other variable types along with other keywords, but those are sort of the basic 5 that you'll be using for common operations in script. As you're working and working through extending other classes, you'll see other uses of them that will probably be kind of self-explanatory, or you can go do a bit more research on the Unreal Developer Network site. There's plenty of information, books available, but we just don't want to cover too many of the nitty-gritty details of what you can do, because we just want to kind of cover the basics and be able to get you going with writing your own UnrealScript files. Okay, so now we've already gone over a couple of the basic variable types. Definitely the most commonly used ones in the script functions you'll be writing or classes. So let's quickly go over also variable declaration. So now we know the types of variables. How do you actually declare them in script? So right here, we're going to go ahead and say var or var for a variable. And so this defines that you are declaring a variable. Here you have an option to put in a keyword. Some examples of keywords are const for a constant value. Basically, you're saying this value will not change or cannot change. There's also a couple other things, like you can declare a private variable. And what a private variable does is, in the case of class extensions or inheritance, which we'll be talking about later, a class that is derived from the class we're defining now would not be able to make edits to a private variable because it doesn't have permission. If you want to change that variable, you would have to expose the ability to change that through a function in this class, thus giving access to it in child classes. But we'll go over the inheritance thing and how to extend a class a little bit later. So just know that this can be a keyword value, but it's not required, and probably in most cases, you won't actually need to define a keyword. So the next thing that is required is the type. So this is, as we went over the variable types above, here's where we're going to define what type of variable we're creating. So we can say this is a bool. So now we've defined a variable that is going to be a bool, and now we need to give it a name. So we can just call it my bool. So you'll notice the semicolon at the end of the line there. Basic syntax for UnrealScript, and this is familiar to C programmers will know this. A semicolon is how you end a line, essentially. So when the script is compiled, then it'll go line by line, and every time it hits a semicolon, the compiler knows that that statement is essentially done, and it will do its thing with that, and then it will go on to the next line. There are some exceptions to that rule, but that's generally going to be something that you're always going to be placing at the end of each line. And again, if you've done any C programming, you know where that comes from. All right, so right there we have defined a bool value. It's not doing anything yet, but now, further down the line, we can manipulate that bool, set it to true or false. As we talked about earlier, that's a true or false value. But we could check against that by saying if my bool equals true, then go ahead and do this or call this function. A couple other things that you can do with variable declaration. One thing that you may be doing is you're needing to make changes to the object that you're creating an UnrealScript file for. Maybe you're going to make this a placeable object in the editor. For instance, you've got lots of different types of triggers in the Unreal editor. You've got the default trigger. You've got different volumes which you can create from the brushes, such as a physics volume. Also, you can basically create your own and say, I've got this trigger type. You've got a game where you need a special type of trigger, so this is going to be your trigger 2.0 basically, and you want to have some special things that happen with it. Well, what you can do is when you're creating this class, which will be your new trigger, you can define variables when you're creating these new variables, and you can say whether or not you want to be able to edit these in the editor. So, just to back up, the option is if you want to have the object that you're creating in UnrealScript to be a placeable object in the editor, and you want to have properties that you can edit, then in addition to the variable definition, you can also put just simple open close parens. And what that does is that defines that this value should also be represented in the object's properties in the editor. Now, if you leave them blank, it will assume no category and just go to the default category. You have the option to type in, a category here, which could be my options, we'll say. So what that would do was when you placed an instance of this actor or object in the editor and you opened up the properties panel, you would see that there would be an additional category called My Options with the My Bool represented there, and you could set that value of that variable in the editor. So again, if you leave this blank, it'll just go into the default options category. If you do not put the parentheses on the variable declaration, then this variable will only be, I guess you could say, visible to the script file. You won't see this anywhere in the editor. All right, so moving right along. The other thing you can do with variable declaration is create an array. And if you're not familiar with the term array from programming, this is basically a list is another way to think of it. If you think of just a list of a lot of different elements. Now, an array is a contiguous block in memory. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get these different elements. So I guess one way to show it is if I say put the brackets here, and we'll just say 2, just to be simple. So what I've defined here is instead of just defining a bool called my bool, I've defined an array of bools. And my bool is still the name of that, but now I have 2 different components or items in the array. So you can get to that by when you're working with your bool, you can say my bool sub 0. And what that's saying is it's 0 base and saying I want the first entry in my array of bools. So this could be a value. We'll say it's equal to true. Okay, so we've got true, and then you say my bool is equal, sub 1, is equal to false. So now you've got this array of bools, and the different elements in there each have a different value. So instead of it just being a true or false value, you've got this array, and now you have to what they call index into the array using that numerical entry, which is 0 based. So my bool sub 0 is saying the first element in the array is equal to true. My bool sub 1 is equal to false. Using bools is kind of a funny example for an array because you probably wouldn't do that too often, but it's a good kind of case for showing it. A case where you would see this more often would be something like inventory, for instance. If you've got weapon inventory, each weapon that you have, that you're carrying, your character is carrying with you, could be an element in that array. So, inventory sub 0 is the pistol. Inventory sub 1 is the machine gun. Inventory sub 2 would be your sniper rifle. For other things, you might be using dynamic arrays too, which mean that they're not necessarily going to be, the same length. Like we're defining this one as 2 elements, but it would actually be something that could change over time. And there's additional functions that you can use to say, like, I want to add a new element, and then the script intelligently handles basically allocating additional memory if it needs to change the size of the array. You don't have to worry about that stuff. That's getting a little bit more advanced though, so let's just go back to the variable declaration right now. Then we'll get rid of the array. So now we're back to just a basic bool. So the other thing that you can do is declare, there's basically two ways you can use a variable in UnrealScript. One of them has more or less, I guess you could say global scope, although global really isn't the right word, but to the instance of this class, the way we've declared this myBool variable is it is available to anything in the class. So its lifetime is the lifetime of this object. But you can also define variables that you do not want to stay around using the local keyword. So by defining the variable or declaring the variable with the local keyword instead of the keyword, var, we're going to have a value here, and we'll just call this some value. So what we have here is an integer that is has local scope to the function that is created within. And what that means is that when that function is complete and exits or returns to the calling function, that the memory that was allocated for this variable will be released back to the system, and UnrealScript has garbage collection that will recover that memory for you. If you're used to more C-style programming, you may be used to kind of allocating your memory as well as deleting the variables that you created. But in this case, you don't really have to mess with that as long as that's what the local keyword is for. So just kind of recap, the var declaration for variable is giving that variable, or is used for class declaration, and gives that instance of that object, that class object, this variable will have the same lifetime as that. And then inside of a function, when you're declaring new variables, you want to use the local keyword, which is what's telling UnrealScript that is local to that function, and when the function returns out, that variable no longer needs to hang around. In some cases, if you're doing like lower level C programming and you're used to allocating memory yourself, you also have the responsibility to clean that memory up. This just handles it for you. All you have to do is mark it as a local variable. So we'll do some more local variables when we get into functions later. So before we move on, I wanted to just quickly kind of add in a few more lines, more or less just restating what we talked about with the different ways you can declare a variable that you want to be available in the Unreal editor in the property panel for that object if you want to be able to edit this value. Just going to make sure that this is here for reference. So again, just the adding the parentheses will cause this value to show up in the property panel for this actor type. And then also you can specify a category by putting a named string, or just a string in general, inside of those parentheses. As we talked about too, there's the different keywords that you can insert here, such as const is one we talked about. I didn't really want to try to cover all of them, or even the more commonly used ones, because there really is a large number of these, and they all have a fairly specific use case. And you'll probably just pick up on a lot of it from when you're looking at other files and seeing how they were written and their use case. A lot of times too, it's sort of like if you're really writing like final game code, then there's a lot of things you have to consider, such as memory management and just safety, as far as like if this object is going to be if this class is going to be extended, you want to make sure you're using private or protected variables when that's appropriate. But in a lot of cases, just for kind of learning how the flow of UnrealScript goes, that's not necessarily going to be required, in my opinion. So it's not really something I feel like we need to cover right now. We're just going to kind of keep it basic and just kind of get you familiar with how stuff is structured and declared in this case, and then you'll pick up on a lot of the other use cases for the keywords as you're getting more and more familiar with UnrealScript. Okay, so quickly before we go on to kind of the other topics, we've talked about here variables that would be declared, inside of a class. We mentioned the local definition for inside a function. So as we're going through this overview, kind of in this overview file, we're going to be just kind of presenting everything in the simplest form. But just wanted to reiterate that outside of variable declaration and function declaration, pretty much everything you're going to be doing inside of UnrealScript is going to be happening inside a function. So even if we're showing, an example here, just kind of outright and plain, for instance, like a for loop or a while loop or an if statement, those are all going to be contained inside of functions at that point. And we're going to talk about functions in a little bit more detail later. But the basic kind of format is going to be function, my function. And at simplest format, that's a function right there. And so all the stuff that would happen, whether it was a local variable declaration or, an if statement, which we're going to get to here, just all these different things are going to be happening inside of a function. So it's good to, obviously understand this flow. And as you look at existing UnrealScript classes, you're going to see this pretty much, anything you're going to be doing operation-wise is going to be happening inside of a function. General class structure is going to be a variable declaration, and then, a list of the functions that are available inside that class, and then all of the logic for those functions is going to take place inside these curly braces. So just wanted to kind of reiterate that function is where you're doing most of your work. So as we're going through examples and showing everything kind of in its simple standalone format, just know that would be, when you're writing this stuff, you're going to be doing that inside of functions. Okay, so now we can go ahead and go on to the next sections, and we will come back to the actual topic of functions and talk about some of the other keywords and defining your own arguments and things like that in a little more depth. But I want to go over just the basics first.